This is Yevamos, a Daf I involve. All the learning has been generously sponsored as an incredible schos for Shlema for Chadvalei Abbas Saradina Mirtashem. The learning of the entire Chavura should bring Chadvalei Abbas Saradina an incredible and complete refuah shalema, as well as learning Shvius Chashilav Shalchaim and Devar Tamisiv Abbas Arach Shalom Lizavalik Benteli Shiv and Chayv Lemnitis Bas Sima Malka, as well as Refuah Shalema Shal Yasser Nefedesh Mamatila Navzal Zim Echlas and Ocham Bas Yivas Arblum Bas Mendo Shavim Shechana Chay Moshe Yeshua Ben Malka B'Soich Shar Chayli Yisrael. We're holding on the bottom of Ayin Heyam and Beis, and we're in the middle of trying to figure out which type of kruz shivcha is that which is possible, and what is the halacha lemaisa. So yesterday we concluded three lines into the white lines that Rava said kavaseid Rav Huna mistavra, because one is shalad by Ivira, one is loy shalad by Ivira. Amalei Ravina le'ameimar, and he says no. Hachi Amar Mar Zutra, 5 lines into the white lines, and Ainayam and Beis. So says Rav Zutra Mishmeder Ababa El Chasa, Bein Ki Kulmis, Bein Ki Marziv. These are two different ways that the Aver could be severed, like a cooler, like a gutter. Either way, he says that it is Ksheira. Why? However, the question is, which part? Where is this severing of the Aver? Is it below or above the corona, the member itself, the fleshy head, or not? Where exactly is this issue? Says the Gemara, what's your question? It must be that it's severed above the corona, the member itself. Why? We saw already that if it's lamata me'atara, even if the entire gid is severed, it still is kosher. So the case must be that it's lamata. And says the Gemara, Ravina was that Rebbe that says, I was just trying to test you. He was just trying to test Mereimar. Says the Gemara, a few stories, 3 lines to the bottom. There's a story Mar Bar Mechasya, Mar Bar Avashi had both sides cut down like a quill in a certain scenario, and he says it was kosher. That's not called a kruv shivcha, and you're allowed to marry a yid. There's a story in Pamadisa is tatim gufsa the shechva zera, and the tube in which the zera, the semen, comes out of became clogged. And what happened? There's 2 tubes inside the aver, and instead of coming through the tube that the zera is supposed to come out, he came out of the tube in which the ketanim, which the urine came out of. So Savar Rabbi Rabbi thought it's kosher. Lamaisa, the zera is coming out, the aver is intact. Who cares? What's the difference which tube it's coming out of? But Amar Rabbi, he said Rabbi Misham Da'asu, because you come, turning over to today's daf, I involve him at Aleph. Mimulai, you come from a place of short people. Amrita Mili and Melita. You're saying cut up things, you're saying truncated things. What are you saying? And he explained, when the zera, the semen, comes out of the right tube, what happens? It's mivashla, literally cooks, it boils, it becomes potent, it's able to impregnate the woman. But if it comes out the wrong tube, it's no longer potent, and therefore he explained that it would puzzle, because again, the whole purpose and the whole crux of the idea of Krishivcha is whether this man is able to impregnate a woman or not. So it's true the zera is coming out, but because it's coming out of the wrong place, it doesn't have the potency, and therefore it will passel. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Nikev v'nistam. He said the following case. Let's say there was a hole in the aver, and then what happened? They plugged up the hole. Kol she'ilu nikri v'nikra passel. When the zera would come out, what would happen? It would rip open the hole, and it would leak out of that side hole. Then it's possible, because again, it's not coming out the appropriate way, and it won't be able to have a child. Vilav, it's going to be kosher. It says the Gemara, Rava was thinking about this and asked 5 lines from the top, Heicha, what exactly? Where is this hole? We're talking about that on the aver, there's some sort of hole. They plugged it up, but the problem is that now when he ejaculates, the zera is going to leak out the side. side, and they said it's possible. So said Rav, where is this hole that's going to passel? Like we saw a moment ago, if it's underneath, what's the question? That even if it's completely cut off, it's going to be kosher. So it can't be there. Must be on the atara itself. And that was the question. And based off of this, the Gemara explains it's marnami, like we just said, Amar Mari bar Mar, Amar Maruk bar Mashmol, Nikim ba'atara atzma, Vinistem, Kol Shil Nikra, Nikra Puzzle, if it's going to leak out, it's going to be puzzle, Vilav, kosher. It's going to be kosher. And as we mentioned in the previous year, these Gemaras are extremely relevant to Halach L'Mais, different medical procedures and surgeries. Often, very, very, I don't want to say very, very common, but these are scenarios in which these Gemaras come into play. Says the Gemara, Shalach lei Rava brei de Rabba l'Rav Yosef. Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, you taught us. Heichi avdinan. What do we do in the case of the previous, meaning how do we test if the previous case is accurate? What do we just say? We said someone who has a hole and they puncture up the aver. Now we have to figure out whether the zera comes out of the side hole and it passels, or does it come through the top and it's kosher. But he said, how do we figure this out? This is a single man and he wants to know, he wants to come marry into Klal Yisrael. He wants to marry a regular girl. So how do we test to see whether indeed the surgery was good or not? So Amar Lei, Rabbi Yosef responds, you know what we do? Masina nenama chamima. We bring hot bread, the sairi of barley bread. Umanchina le'abe pokri umikri. And what do? We place it on the back hole of the man, on the anus, and what do? And that causes, because of the proximity to the aver, it causes the zera to come out. And therefore we're going to check. We're going to see, where does the zera come out of? If it comes out of this side hole, it will passel. If it comes straight through the top, it's going to be kosher. Says Abaye, Amar Abaye, Atukuli Alma Yaakov Avinu Havai. Is everyone as kosher as Yaakov Avinu? They have to do this extreme test in order for the zera to come out. It says about Yaakov Avinu, that it says when he gave birth to Reuven, it was the first strength. It was the first time he ever saw zera in his life. Asks Abaye, is this true? No. Says Abaye, you don't have to be so extreme. El Amar Abaye, my friend Kame Big D says Abaye, we bring him in front of him colorful clothing of a woman, we make him get aroused, and that's going to cause him to see zera. He's going to have him a seminal discharge, and we're going to know where it comes out of. Amar Rava says the opposite. Is everyone like Barzilai Galadi? So promiscuous that just by looking at colorful clothing, it's going to cause him to be aroused and see zera? And we'll just point out, and therefore the first teretz is correct. We'll just point out parenthetically, very large discussion in the Paiskim Nachreinim over here. What exactly was going on over here? What was the reason to bring in front of him color clothing? So Rashi just points out, Shel Isha sounds like it's woman's clothing, not necessarily a woman that he knows. If it would be a woman that he knows, there would be an Isser. But again, a large discussion, what exactly is the case over here that we're trying to get him aroused, how exactly that is feasible. And Tanu Rabbanan continues the Gemara 15 lines down. The first line is Mechavart. Tanu Rabbanan Nikev. If again the aver has a hole in it, possibly can marry into Klal Yisrael. The reason is because if there's a hole, what happens? The zera doesn't shoot out; it drips over the side. Nistem. If you plug up the hole, then kashem neishu moilid. Because then what happens? Now we can have children. V'zeu pasal shechayzer lachshira. And this is a case of a psul that could be fixed, because we see that when there was a hole, it's a problem. If you plug it up properly, it's going to be kosher. Says the Gemara, what was this statement that we just saw? Zehu! This is the case of something possible that could be called kosher. Zehu, whenever we say this is the case, it's coming to exclude something else. So what's the case it's coming to exclude? Explains the Gemara, Bareya. It's going to include, in the case of the scar tissue that's around the wound of a lung, the eina krom, which does not seal in the organ properly. This is a Mishnah on Chulin. This has to do with an animal, whether the animal's a treifa, this is some sort of protector covering that's growing over the lung, and this is going to be a case that it's not going to be able to be fixed. So our case, there's a hole that you could cover, and it's yes fixed. The case over there does not fix. Says the Gemara, Sholach lei Ravidi Barabin Abaye Hechi Avdinan. What exactly do we do? Meisina and Sa'arta, we bring a barley kernel, meaning now we're going to learn some medical procedures. They asked, how do we fix this problem? There's a person that has a hole in his aver, how do we plug it up? So says Abaya, Misarin and Sa'arta, we bring a barley kernel, Misartinan lay, and we scratch the area to make the aver bleed. Umaisinan etarba, and we bring some fat, Vishaifinan, and we use the fat to smear around the room, around this incision. Umaisinan shumsha gamla, and then we bring a big ant. This is where it's going to get extreme. Apologies. And we place the head of the hole of the ant into the head of the ant into the hole on the aver. And now the ant bites into the aver. This is getting a bit painful. And as the ant is biting, now the head gets stuck in there. And then we cut off the back of the ant. Now the head of the ant is stuck in this hole, which was slit, bled, and then smeared by fat. It stuck the ant bites, cut off head, and then the hole effectively plugs up the hole. But says the Gemara, one detail everyone remember. V'davka sarta, make sure that you use barley when you scratch the skin. Avol parzala, mizraf, zarif. But if you use steel, it can make a wound. Perhaps this is a primitive understanding of tetanus, etc. So don't use a steel to cut open the wound. And it says the Gemara, so only works when they make a little hole of a gedule mekvule mekvel. But if you make a large puncture, then anything is going to eventually fall off, and it's not going to work. The idea here being we're creating a scab, we're creating scar tissue, and therefore says the Gemara, it has to be a small incision. 4 lines from the wide lines comes along Amarabba Ravuna, and he says Amatal Mayim Mishteim Mekayma is possible. If someone is using the bathroom and he urinates from 2 places, as we saw, that there are two different holes over here, 2 different tubes. So if he urinates through both of them, it's going to puzzle. And Amar Rav, and Rav explained, this is not the halacha lo kibra lo ka'aba. What does that mean? Kibra hadamar. What do I mean by bra? That's what we just said. That was the statement of Rav Huna. The Matamayim Shtei Mekayim is puzzled and explains to Rav that's not true. That even if his Matamayim Shtei Mekayim, he's still able to have children. Therefore, it does not puzzle. And says the Gemara, and Abba, Hadamar and Abba, that Abba is Rav Huna. What is this din of Abba that Rav says is not the halacha? As follows. And this is a Gemara in which we've had previously. We had this a Gemara in Shabbos. Explains the Gemara in the last narrow line. If women rub up against each other, some form of lesbian relations, the women who perform with each other, says the Gemara, it passes likahuna. Va'afilu, and explains the Gemara. Va'afilu Rav Elazar. Now Rav is saying it does not passel. It's kosher. Now we're going to explain why in the first white line. Va'afilu Rav Elazar the Amar Panaba Panu Shalishim Ishas Zaina. If a single man and girl, boy and girl, have relations, it creates a zaina and apostles them from kuna. But it explains Rav honey mili ish. There's a proper relation aval isha. But if there's 2 girls that had some sort of relation with each other, they rubbed up against each other, says Rav, it's pritzusa dalma. It's of course disgusting and inappropriate. However, it does not passel to kahuna. And these are the 2 halachas, says Rava, that are halacha l'maisa. Now we're at a new Mishnah on the bottom of Ayin Vav and Aleph, and we continue our discussion of the psua daka, of this man that has an issue on disabling him from having children, and whether he's allowed to marry and who he's allowed to marry, as we'll see right now. Says the Gemara, psua daka and kuv shivcha, of course, kuv shivcha as well, we spoke about yesterday. These 2 people have different issues with their aver, with the testicles, etc. What's the halacha? Mutarin, they're not allowed to marry a yid, but they're allowed to marry bigiyoyres umishachreres. They're allowed to marry a woman who becomes a ger and a slave that becomes free. The only usher to come into Klal Yisrael to marry regular Yisrael, Shenamar, so they can't marry a regular Bikal Hashem, but they're allowed to marry a Giyoyres and a Mishachreres. And the rest of today is going to center around this thing. So they asked the following from Rav Shishas, Psuadaka Koyen, Ma'u B'Giyoyres Mishachreres. The Mishnah was talking about a Yisrael, a regular Jew that becomes a Psuadaka, because Shivcha said the Mishnah, he can't marry a regular Yid Kal Hashem. Who could he marry? A Giyoris and a Mishachreris. Ask the Gemara, what about a Koyin? Is a Koyin who is a Psuadaka, is he allowed to marry a Giyoris and a Mishachreris? And the Gemara now explains what's the question. Bikdusha say koyin, v'asar do he say he's a koyin, and a koyin has halacha. You're not allowed to marry a geiris. You're not allowed to marry a mishachreris. And therefore, even though he's a kros shivcha, even though he's a suadaka, he still has a din of a koyin. He still remains within his kedusha. Therefore, he cannot marry them. Or do we say no? Because he's a psuadak and a kushivcha, he does not have the status as being biktush of a kohen, and therefore he'd be allowed to marry the giyaris and the mishachreris. So answers the Gemara, Amar le Rav Shishas Tenitua. I'll bring you a raya from the Braisa. Psuadaka Yisrael mutar b'nesina. Says the Braisa that a psuadaka of a regular Yisrael is allowed to marry Nesina. A Nesina being one who is generally from the Shiva Amimim and is not allowed to marry a regular Yisrael, but a psuadaka is allowed to. So explains the Gemara. If you're going to tell me that this psuadaka is a regular status of a Yid, ikri kan lotus we should apply here that you're not allowed to marry a Nesina. So from the fact that the Psuadaka can yes marry Nesina shows me a Psuadaka is not considered Bikdushas Kai, and therefore by extension we have a right to our question that a Koyin will as well be allowed to marry a Geras and Mishachreris. Amar Rava says Rava no Raya. Says Rava, the fact that in a Psuadaka Yisrael can marry Nesina has nothing to do with Kedusha. Dilma Moilid Ben. The reason why the Psuadaka is allowed to marry Nesina is because generally, why are you not allowed to marry Nesina? Because we're afraid that the child is going to go and marry a guy. But over here, because he's a Psuadaka, he can't have any children. That is the reason why you'll be allowed to marry this Nesina. But when they become Girim, they are allowed. So the Isser to marry the Nesina is only a din d'Rabbanan, but it's only when there could be a child, because we're afraid the child's going to follow his parent and go and worship idols. But this person, because he is a Shivcha, he is a Suadaka, therefore he cannot have children, therefore Lagaz B'Rabbanan, therefore he cannot, there's no Gzeir D'Rabbanan. But says the Gemara, there's no Raya to our question of a Koyin Suadaka Shivcha, if he could marry a Gyeres or a Mishachreres. So says the Gemara, Elameata, asked the Gemara, Mamzer the B'nei Uludei, Hachinami Da'asir, based on what you just said, a Mamzer could have children. So based on what you just said, a Mamzer should be usher to marry Nesina. But we learned based on your explanation of who's allowed to marry Nesina, that all has to do with the children. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. A mamzer could have a child, so why is a mamzer allowed to marry Nesin? He could have a child, and therefore we should be concerned. Explains the Gemara. Ella explains Rabba ki gad rabbanim b'chsherim b'psulim like gazvei rabbanim. The whole gezerah is only by ksherim and not by pesulim. So therefore, says the Gemara, great, but we don't have any raya to a psuadaka kain whether you can marry geras mishachreres. Rather, later on, what happened? Adam Aravala Melsi. What I said is incorrect. B'yoisam akam les b'lu chasenos. What I said is incorrect because while the Nesina before they become a gerim, there's no concept of chasanos to a guy. Nisgairu islu chasanos. Only once they become gerim, there is a chasanos, and therefore the Isser does apply even after they became gerim. Because a Jew is not allowed midaraisa to marry a Nesin, yet a Psuadak and a Kushivcha is yes allowed to marry a Nesin. So therefore we do have a clear raya that it's not a Bikdusha Sekai, and therefore we have a raya to original Shaila that a Koyin Psuadaka can yes marry Geras and Shachreres. But Masev Rav Yosef, 2 lines on the bottom. You just told me that there's no concept of marriage of Chasanos to a Goy. Now we're going to go into bit of a segue, a left turn, figuring out a right turn, whether this indeed is accurate. There's no din of chasanas to guy. So again, we answered up our kasha about a koyin kushivcha, a koyin psuadaka that can marry a geris and a mishachreres, because they're not b'kedushas kai. But the way to answer that question was to say that zedin daraisa not to marry nesina, because midrabana lo tischatin can apply, because lo tischatin can only apply after they become gerim. Now, ask the Gemara, is that accurate? Is it true? There's no such concept of chasanas to a guy. Maser Rabbi Yosef beischatin Shloimo's bas Baharai Melch Mitzrayim. Shloimo Melch married the daughter of Baharai. So what do we see? Even though she's the daughter of Baharai, we see that the pasuk calls it chasanas. Explains the Gemara, Geiri Gori Shloimo HaMelech made her a Geires, and therefore that's what is chasanas. Ask the Gemara, wait, follow Kiblu Geirim Lo Bnei David Lo Bnei Shloimo. But the Brisa says that there was no Geirim in the times of David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech. Answers the Gemara in the last line. The reason they did not accept Gerim is only because they were afraid that this guy is being Megayer in order to get from the king's table. But this girl, as we turn over to the base, is a daughter of Baharai. She didn't need the cash, therefore they would accept Gerim from her. Ask the Gemara further, how is he let to marry her? She's a mitzvah. And the lacha is you're not allowed to marry an Egyptian girl, a first generation Egyptian. Maybe you'll suggest a very interesting suggestion. Maybe the whole Isser to marry the Mitzrim, that until 3 generations, as we'll see in the next Mishnah in a few moments, maybe that was only in the times of Parai, times of the Yidden and Mitzrayim. But this was generations later, so the Isser disappears and there's no longer an Isser. Says the Gemara, you can't tell me that. Vatani learned in a Brayso from Rav Yehuda Binyamin. Ger Mitzri, the person's name was Binyamin, he was a Ger. He was a friend of Rabbi Akiva. Omar, and he explained, Ani Mitzri Rishon in Asati Mitzvahs Rishona. I was a first generation Mitzri that married a first generation Mitzvahs. Asi Lebeni Mitzvah Shania. And he explained it, he says, I'm going to marry my son, Asi Lebini Mitzvah Shnia, because the kid was a Shnia as well. I'm going to marry him to a second generation Mitzvahs, Kedeshi Ben Bini Ro Ilave Bekal. And he said this so that that child, the grandson, will be a third generation Mitzvah. You can marry the Klal Yisrael. But what do we see? We see that the din of Mitzvah even applies nowadays in the times of Rabbi Akiva. So what's going on with Shlomo HaMelech and Bas Baharai? So Amar Papa Anan Mishloimai Leikuv Inisiv. Are we asking a question from Shlomo HaMelech? Shlomo Loi Nasiv Midi. Shlomo HaMelech never married her. D'chsev Bey Min Hagem Asher Amar Hashem Al Bnei Yisrael Lo Savo Bahem V'Heim Lo Yavoy Bachem. As the pasuk explains, Shlomo HaMelech didn't actually marry them. He loved these girls, but they never actually had a proper marriage. Says the Gemara, wait, the pasuk says chasanos. Explains the Gemara, no, because of the incredible love that Shlomo HaMelech had for these girls, it was as if he married them, but there was no actual marriage, and therefore the whole question never starts because there was never a marriage from Shlomo HaMelech. Amar lei Ravinu Ravashi v'atanan. We go back to our original question of Ipsuadaka Kruvshivcha to let him marry Nesina. So ask Ravinu Ravashi, what about the Mishnah that says Ipsuadaka Kruvshivcha mutar is bigaris v'shachreres? Ha b'nesina asira. The Mishnah says who are they let him marry? Our Mishnah. Okay, Iris and Mishachreres. The implication is they can't marry Nesina. Amar Lei Ravashi responds, no, Rayu L'Tamech, wait till what you're saying, look at the end of the Mishnah. What does it say? So what's the implication of this Seifa? The Seifa says, let him marry a Yid. They're not letting marry Yid, which means they can marry Nesina. The Reisha says they can marry Yeres and Mishacharis, which means they cannot marry Nesina. That's called the contradiction. Elameha, anytime the Reisha and the Seifa have contradictory implications, Leka, Lamashma, Mi, no. Continuing the Gemara, we're at the Mishnah, 5 lines from the white lines, and I involve them in base. Very time sensitive as Shavuos is on the horizon. You're not letting marry forever. I will make voiceam and amoinis and amoyavis. Mutaris miyad right away. But mitzri ba'adaimi in asurna la'shishadaris. You're only allowed to marry a mitzri and a daimi for 3 generations. You're not allowed. Echad scharim and a kevais. girls also for 3 generations. Rav Shimon matter that gave us miyad, says Rav Shimon, I don't get it. A mitrin adaimi, of course are matter miyad. Why? Amar Rav Shimon gavel chaymer advarim. Umay b'makashas zchar mitzrayim lameters, and it gave us miyad when it came to Amonia Moavi that you're never allowed to marry the males, and yet the females are allowed right away. Makayim, when it comes to mitzvah adaimi shaloy aser zchar melad shlish dairais, the man you only not let him marry for 3 generations. Certainly Shanatan gave us miyad. So Amrullah, they responded in halacha nikabel. V'im ladin yesh tshuva, that if it's halacha, if you heard this, you have a Messiah will accept it. But if you're only saying it based on akal v'chaymer yesh tshuva, I could ask you a question on it. Amr lahem, Rav Shimon responded, ki halach loy, ki halacha ani aymer, I have a Messiah about this. So says the Gemara, we're just going to begin. Minani imili, where do we know this? De'enam avamoini uma'avis. Amayni ubayavi are only usher than males, but the nekevais are mutter. Rav Yochanan Amar Kra says in the pasuk, and we're going to have a long and lengthy journey through Shmuel Beis. The Karais ukerais Shaul as David yaitz the grass up lishti when Shaul Hamelech. So David going towards the Palestine. Amar says Shaul Hamelech El Avner Tzara Tzva was a general ben Mizahanar. Avner, whose son is this? Avner. So Shaul asks Avner, whose kid is this person going forwards? V'yomer Avner, Chai nafshcha hamelech im yadati v'lo yada. Chai nafshcha hamelech, by your life of your king. I don't know. Im yadati. Ask the Gemara. V'lo yadale. Did Shaul really not know who David HaMelech was? V'akseva yaveh ma'idi loved him alav yiloi noisei kilim. And he became his armor bearer. He carried his weapons. So how could Shaul HaMelech say he didn't know David HaMelech? Ella explains the Gemara, perhaps Avu Kamashal. Maybe Shaul was asking Avner about David HaMelech's father. And he knows his father. Says Gemara, really? This is Yishai, who went in with a multitude and out with a multitude. So he knew his father as well. So explains the Gemara, this is what Shaul was saying. Mi Peretz asi, mi Zerach asi. Does David HaMelech come from Peretz or from Zerach? Me Peretz asi Malkava. If he comes from Peretz, he's going to be a king. Why? Shamelech pirates last is Derek. Because a king breaks through, pirates others' fences and makes a path for himself. And you can't protest. But if this person, David, comes from Zerach, Hashiva Ba'almavoy, he's just going to be Chashiv. He's not going to be king. My time, what's the reason? Amar le, Sha'al. What is the reason that Shaul said to Avner to ask about him? Tersev, as the pasuk says, V'yilba Shaul as David, and Shaul dressed David mi-daf. What does it see? What do we see from Midav? When Shaul HaMelech got David dressed, Kim Midasa, it was the clothing fit him perfectly. The shoulders he was taller than any other people. So since Shaul saw that his clothing fit David HaMelech as a nace, so Shaul asked, "What's going on over here? Is David HaMelech going to be a king? Something's going on." So Amrli Daiga Adami Ashata Mashal loves. Says Daiga Adami. He jumps in. He says to Shaul, before you ask about him, why are you asking if David HaMelech is going to be king? Find out, is he a Yid? My time with the Kasim he comes from Rus. He comes from Mayavis. So are you asking if he's going to be king? He's probably not even a kosher Yid. So Amrli Avner, Tanina, Amoini, V'loi Mayavis, Mayavi, V'loi Mayavis, and therefore David HaMelech is a kosher Yid. But I asked, Mamzer Kseva Mum Zar, but not to buy here. We're going to stop over here, but this is where we see the very famous drasha of Amoini, V'loi Mayavis, Amoini, Mayavi, V'loi Mayavis. Of course, David HaMelech coming from Rus was kosher, ultimately would become Melech. We'll pick up from here, Mitzvah Hashem, in the next.